And now, Chapter 20 of The Last Boy on Earth. First Contact. They sat in front of the Kenwood transceiver with the dull humming of the diesel generator outside in the darkness. Awash in the yellowish glow from the transceiver's interface, Brady and Kaylee were rapt with attention as the wizard began to move his hands over buttons and dials and readied himself for the proper incantation. Few broadcasts in the history of humanity held so much hope and promise, thought Joe, except perhaps the signals sent by Marconi over the Atlantic, or the signals sent from the lunar module of Apollo 11 to the satellite dish in Australia to be beamed around the planet. Joe stole a glance over his shoulder at the two young people who now shared his life, and was astounded. Here he was, a man nearing the final days of his own life, presented with a peculiar conundrum. He knew that if these two were to survive, they would need all the help they could get. To be sure, the girl was brilliant and intuitive, and he was certain the boy was not unlike himself, a problem solver with a good attitude. Such beings might be able to survive and help the species back onto its feet, but they were young, and there was so much for them to know, so much for them to do. Facing the end of his life, he'd given up any reason to go on, and then fate intervened. Beyond all hope. Hope. And now he had one final task to complete, and it was, he judged, the most important one of his life. He needed to prepare them for all the possibilities that lay ahead of them. For now, though, the simplest thing seemed to be the most difficult. If they could reach Radio Ukraine, they would no longer be disconnected. People need food, water, and shelter, but more than anything else, they need a reason to keep going, a reason to believe, a reason to go on. Joe pressed the button at the base of his microphone and leaned forward, saying, "This is K1KJV broadcasting 100 watts at HF to any station that can copy, specifically seeking Radio Ukraine International Station seeking contact. Does anyone copy?" Joe turned a knob gently, and the numbers on the LED display moved slightly. They heard the crackling whisper of the universe in the form of static, that white noise from which an answer would come. It had to come. After a moment, there was still no response. Joe could see the crestfallen look on their faces. "Nothing to worry about. We have to keep saying it over and over. If they hear us, they'll have to tune us in. The signal we're broadcasting is strong, and because it's night, it's going all the way up to the ionosphere, where it bounces down to them. Sometimes you have to repeat yourself over and over again before you get an answer. The damn northern lights have been playing hell with the upper atmosphere lately, so it's likely to mask our broadcast a little. We can try other frequencies, try to narrow down the signal, boost its power. Well, they ought to be monitoring all frequencies." The hope that had quickly retreated from their faces returned. Joe continued to speak into the microphone, sending their lone message upwards towards the cold void of space. As he dutifully spoke into the microphone every 30 seconds or so, Joe's mind wandered to his own reason for connecting with others. He would never travel to meet other humans. He was too sick, too frail, too near the end. If the insulin ran out, he'd be dead in a week. He was ready to accept this, and he had enough of religion in him to believe in the afterlife, and was, in his own way, looking forward to reconnecting with beloved others. But then he would wonder if there was an afterlife after all, and that led him to doubt, which made him despair. But from the apocalypse came forth these two young people, and right now, the next world, if it even existed at all, didn't seem to matter. His work here seemed mighty in comparison to all else he had accomplished in his life. Grendel stood in the middle of an open field some distance from the city on top of Copeland Hill on the Eddington side of the great river. He made the journey out to the highest point with the guidance of the others, those ancient enemies of humanity that had melded themselves to his body and his spirit so that they might survive after their food supply had been exhausted. Grendel's hatred and purpose fed them now, and when he suffered, they suffered. Since the departure of the two humans, Grendel had sought out other means of discovering their whereabouts, methods he had never known of, taught him by his own version of whisperers. On the edge of the field, a very large number of were-dogs sat on their haunches, awaiting his command. Even those who had not fed of late submissively waited for their master's voice. Perhaps 400 of the creatures, the first army of the changed world, sat at attention, watching. Around the perimeter strolled Fenris, the largest and most cunning of them all. Every so often he rose from his hind legs and walked like a man for several feet, and whenever he did this, the were-dogs nearest to him cowered back in fear. If one of the creatures made even the slightest noise, his keen hearing caught it, and he would rush to the creature and silently stare it down to the ground. Grendel stood 100 feet away from them, alone except for the hundreds of voices whispering in his head, and one in particular spoke most clearly. "They are using the air to communicate with the others over vast distances. They are using technology from the human world to speak to each other." Another voice whispered in the background, "Clever, they think they are." Grendel asked quietly, "Yes, but where are they? Which direction? How far?" The voices were arguing, but the first voice broke in. "They are to the northeast, I think. They are a day's run, away at least. We cannot reach them this night." Grendel paced back and forth across the field, stamping down the grass. "If they contact other humans, they increase their chances of survival. Together, they are strong. Together, they are better able to fight us," he said as calmly as he could manage. "Disrupt their speaking," said the first voice. "You can summon the thunder. You can speak to the elements. We saw you do this when the city burned. You must do this again." Grendel grunted and lowered his chin to his chest. What the voice was suggesting was tiring and wore him away like a blade on a grindstone, but there seemed to be no other alternative. They could not physically reach them until sometime tomorrow night. "How do they speak over such distances? The world has gone silent." "They are using the pulses of the spectrum, Lord. They speak with charged particles. They throw them up into the sky, and they fall toward Earth again. In this manner they speak," whispered a sniveling voice from the crowd of voices in his head. A flash of understanding could be seen on Grendel's face. "Radio. They are using radio. I see. Yes, I had not thought of that. Clever little. Well, there is a way to stop them, at least for now." The voices surged with excitement. How? They inquired. "It will take all of my strength of mind and spirit. I will be weak when I am done, and I will need some time to grow strong again, but some of you will perish in the attempt." At once, the enemies of humanity that had joined Grendel began to protest vociferously. They had not agreed to sacrifice themselves so that he could live. They were not expendable. They had agreed to the bonding so that they might survive, not perish. There were some voices asking, "Which ones will die? As long as it's not me, that's fine." Grendel laughed in the deepest abyss of his heart at these voices, for they would be the first to expire. Their frustration and despair fell on deaf ears. Grendel had made up his mind, and there would be no changing it. Then the voice of the hag filled his mind, one of the enemies of humanity that had chosen not to meld with him, the one he called Mother. "You are a fool, little boy. You're a fool to even try. Why destroy them when they could rebuild and fill the world with people upon which we could feed?" "Shut up, toothless one," he growled. "Be still." The voice of the hag said, "From the edges of the abyss I will fight you, little boy. I will help them if I can, if only to feed upon their children in years to come. I was here before you, and I will survive." "Oh, shut up, I hope you die," he muttered under his breath, having no power over this elderly, powerful enemy. I will hover at the edge of midnight, and when you fall, I will warm my hands over your funeral pyre, little boy, she cackled, and she said no more. He called Fenris to his side. Yes, master. Fenris was now on all fours again. Grendel didn't like it when he walked like a man in front of him. He preferred submission. Soon I am going to call forth a force from within me and send it skyward. I may collapse and seem to be dead, but I will be alive. You will protect this body until it awakens. It may take some time while I regain my strength, and during that time you shall be my co-regent in charge of this world. Fenris felt the urge to please his master sink into his mind like an incisor into a slab of meat, and he lowered himself, crouching. Yes, I will protect you from them, he said, indicating the were-dog pack. With your very life, if you must, urged Grendel. To the death, replied Fenris. Good, it is settled. So it begins. And with that, Grendel did something he rarely did. He dropped to his knees and curled his massive body into a ball, making himself smaller, concentrating all of his energies on the task at hand. In his mind, he chose the enemies who would be sacrificed, so that their life forces might be converted to the necessary overload of power needed to amplify things. In this way, he fought an internal battle, conquering the enemies of humanity within before he could use their power without. When the wrestling was accomplished and the beings within him acquiesced to his will, he formed two fists and arose, legs outstretched to firmly plant himself on the grassy ground. He raised his two arms in defiance of nature to the sky and sent one massive uninterrupted thought skyward. A visible pillar of light could be seen forming from his fists, reaching upward to the inky blackness. This he continued for many minutes with little effect, and Fenris wondered at the actions of his master. Soon the sky began to fill with colors, sheets of red, blue, and green cascading like waves over the ocean. They oscillated and wavered, growing and then falling in intensity over all creation, nearly blocking out all the stars in the sky. With each breath he drew into his lungs, the aurora reacted by expanding. With every exhalation they retreated. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, were now an extension of the mind and body of Grendel, bringer of death, harbinger of a new world without humans. He had hundreds of beings within him, some stronger than others. They lined up within his mind to burn into the sky and be depleted, destroyed forever. How many would he sacrifice tonight so that the humans could not contact each other? The despair of centuries thundered in his mind, but he paid it little attention. The aurora glowed magnificently. This is K1KJV, broadcasting 100 watts at HF to any station that can copy, specifically seeking Radio Ukraine International Station seeking contact. Does anyone copy? Joe had been repeating himself for the last hour with little success. He knew what the problem was. The aurora was too active. There must have been a disturbance in the sun because the aurora was an electrical storm in the Earth's upper atmosphere caused by solar particles. They often knocked out satellites and shut down power grids if they were strong enough. As much as he didn't want to admit it, the growing borealis was a bad sign. He didn't want to lie to Brady and Kaylee, but he gleaned that they might already be sensing his mind. It's not going to work, Kaylee said. Let's go take a look, Joe said, and he reached for his cane. They went off the back porch and looked at the sky. They were speechless for several moments. How could nature paint such a canvas? What were the pigments, and from where did these colors arise? Brady thought that he'd not even seen some of these colors before in his life, like they were entirely new to the spectrum of nature. Their beauty, haunted by the movement of the particles, stunned Kaylee, but she was also surprised by what she thought she heard. She could swear she could hear screaming coming from the sky, from the northern lights themselves. It was as though the lights were the dying cries of what? She tried to force herself to think she was imagining these sounds, but she failed. It was Brady who finally spoke. I can hear them screaming, he said. Joe nodded and said, Me too. What the hell is that? Kaylee said simply, Death. I hear it too. Something that screams like that is dying. They watched and listened as the northern lights covered the entire night sky like a funeral pall, like a death shroud, like a winding sheet. "We can't give up," Brady said. "This is Grindel's doing. He's causing this." Both Kaylee and Joe looked at him with wonder. "How do you know?" asked Joe, who tended to believe Brady even when he sounded like he was saying utterly impossible and fantastic things. "I just do. I can tell. He doesn't want us to contact anyone. If we contact others, it'll make us all stronger. He wants us separated and weak, so he can hunt us down and kill us one by one." Joe glanced at Kaylee and then back at Brady. There was a lot of diesel fuel. The repairs on the generator seemed to be holding, and the transceiver was functioning. Was there any way he could think of to boost the power of the transmitter? Maybe we can ramp up the wattage. It might be possible to give this broadcast a boost." Joe shut down the transceiver. He fished around under his desk, and Brady withdrew an old gray steel box that weighed at least 15 pounds. "What's this?" asked Brady. "It's my Hallicrafters, my first transmitter. It's old, like me, but the damn thing has more power than you can imagine. I spent years tinkering with it. I talked all around the world with this thing, but it kept getting harder and harder to find the vacuum tubes. And the world went digital, and so did I. But this old puppy might be just the thing to reach the Ukraine. I bet this thing can broadcast halfway to heaven." Kaylee and Brady repositioned the old Hallicrafters model on the desktop next to another Hallicrafters receiver from beneath the desk and began making the connections instructed by Joe. It didn't take very long before they were ready to switch it on. Joe made his way to the closet, and after rummaging, he found a tall silver microphone with a sidebar switch. It was about a foot high and stood atop a silver base. At the top was a circular wire mesh microphone. Joe plugged it into the transmitter and switched the whole unit on. A warm glow slowly arose inside the vintage machine as the tubes began to warm. "It takes about a minute before she's ready." Kaylee studied the old man's face. Joe was happy. It was like meeting an old friend from long ago, except he'd grown old and this friend had remained a little boy. The old Hallicrafters spoke to him of days gone by, of friends now dead, of family, and teaching his own children the craft, and he was at once filled with remorse and longing. As he readied to speak out into the heavens, he longed for a real heaven. There was no digital LED readout on this machine. Instead, cotton thread covered with beeswax connected to small springs that in turn were connected to wheels and tuning knobs, and they all worked together to move a red needle across a lit dial. And he found the frequency given to him by Radio Ukraine every night for the last 2 weeks and turned up the gain as high as he could. "This is K1KJV broadcasting 100 watts at HF to any station that can copy. Specifically seeking Radio Ukraine International Station seeking contact. Does anyone copy?" And there, from the crystal darkness and through the barrier of the Aurora Borealis, came the faint voice of Tatiana, sole spokesperson for Radio Ukraine and the entire human race. "K1, KJV, I read you. Coordinates, please. East Corinth, Maine, United States of America. There are 3 of us here." After a moment of silence in which they feared they had lost contact, Joe repeated, "This is K1 KJV broadcasting 100 watts at HF to any station that can copy, specifically seeking Radio Ukraine International Station seeking contact. Does anyone copy?" "K1 KJV, your signal is breaking up. Please keep trying." Her voice was fading fast. Through the interference they heard, "Repeat, please transmit coordinates. Where are you?" She hadn't heard them. For the next frantic hour, the 3 small voices in the night called out to the oscillating, variegated sky in all of its terrible awesomeness. They couldn't hear the screaming from inside the house. Instead, they heard Tatiana's voice in her precisely practiced English, over and over again. "K1 KJV, this is Radio Ukraine. Please come in." Their reply was always the same, as Joe calmly kept manipulating the dials and gain, the squelch and volume. Brady found himself losing focus little by little. He was fatigued. Something was happening to him yet again. He sat down in the lounge chair and closed his eyes, his 2 companions oblivious to his collapse. As he shut his eyes, he began to feel weightless. His body no longer bound to the earth. Was he being overwhelmed by fatigue? Was he falling asleep? And then he heard her voice. Who was that? It was a whisperer. He hadn't heard a whisperer since the night of the fire and Kaylee's rescue. Susan had told him they would all leave him alone now. Still, he knew he was in the presence of a whisperer. Perhaps the aurora opened the doorway again and helped him make contact. Brady, he heard her say. Who is this? He said quietly, so that neither of his companions heard. Brady, it's me. It's your mom. He couldn't find words. He could barely find his breath. His heart jumped into his mouth and his mind was reeling. Oh, God, no, please, no, no. If she was a whisperer, then she was dead. But she was speaking to him, which meant that there really wasn't any such a thing as death, just a transition, like birth, from one unseen place to this place and back again. Mom, he said, I've missed you. Tears rolled down his cheeks while over in the corner, hunched over the equipment, sat Kaylee and Joe desperately trying to regain contact. You're in terrible danger again, Brady. You must listen to me. You need to make contact with the other people. They need you. There are people in the Americas right now who are lost and lonely. You need to make contact with them. You need to find them. Go to them. But how? He asked, a smile crisscrossing his face with a frown of confusion. The creature is blocking your transmission, but you have the power to break into the aurora, to divide it and create a window for your transmission to pass through. I do? What? How? He pleaded. She whispered from a well 1,000,000 miles away. Simply join with the equipment. What? How can I do that? He was confused. Could this be his mother? Wasn't she supposed to comfort him? Her window was beginning to close, and she began to grow fainter and fainter, a whisper of a memory of an echo long past against a vast static sea. You must join with the machine. You can be the ghost in the machine. You can boost the signal. Mom, he whispered desperately, will I see you again? She was leaving now. The message she was trying to give to him was essential and important, and she may have crossed distances immeasurable to a mortal to deliver it. Why? To ask him a riddle? How could he join with the machine? She was the second whisperer to tell him that the rest of the world needed him, and he still didn't know why. Susan told him it was because he saw things as they truly are, and now his mother sounded like he was needed to bring hope to others. How? He was only 14, and he barely had any hope left within him at all. How can you give something you don't have? Love you. We'll see you again. Work to do yet. Make contact. She was gone. It was like waking from a seizure. He was exhausted, barely able to get up from the chair. He rose awkwardly and walked over to the old Hallicrafter's transmitter, gently pushing Kaylee aside and moving Joe's wheeled office chair out of the way. And then, without thinking, he turned the transmitter around and stuck both his hands into the back among the capacitors, vacuum tubes, and wiring. Sparks began to fly as Joe and Kaylee began to panic. But surprisingly, Brady was not being electrocuted. He seemed to be in full control of his mind and body, and he felt no pain, just the smallest trickle against his skin. Talk to her now, he said in a strange, calm voice. Joe shot Kaylee a look of terror, but something told him to listen to the boy, who should be on the floor with his eyes rolling into the back of his head and his tongue extending from his mouth. Kaylee's expression was one of shock, but she said boldly, Joe, talk! This is K1KJV broadcasting 100 watts at HF to any station that can copy, specifically seeking Radio Ukraine International Station seeking contact. Does anyone copy? Radio Ukraine copies you. Please identify. 3 of us, Brady, Kaylee, Joe, in East Corinth, Maine, Eastern United States. Do you copy? Another moment of silence and then, copied. K1KJV, 3 of you, East Corinth, Maine, United States. What is your situation? They were shocked with elation, surprised by happiness. Success! Kaylee found herself bending down to hug the seated figure of Joe as a smile spread across his face. They'd done it with this strange, surprising boy who made it all possible. However, instead of hearing Tatiana from Radio Ukraine, another voice filtered down more clearly through the ether, a voice from beyond the world. "Renamer, I hear you." Kaylee and Joe looked at each other, stunned, not comprehending who this could be. But Brady knew, recognizing his growl and his spite. "Grendel," said Grady to the open air without a need for a microphone. "You lost. We escaped." "You are pathetic if you think you've escaped me for long. Even now I track your whereabouts. Even now I know where you are. I smell you on the wind. I taste you in the very wavelengths through which we speak. You can't stop us. We've made contact. You're too late." A deep guttural laugh spewed from the speakers as Grendel said in Tatiana's voice, "This is Radio Ukraine, copied K1KJV. 3 of you, East Corinth, Maine, United States. What is your situation?" Reverting to his own voice, he said, "Sound familiar, Renamer? You and the girl need to know that no matter where you run, you can't hide. I have eyes in the air. I have powers now beyond those when last we grappled and struggled. When we meet again, you will see." Talk is cheap," said Brady, his eyes still closed as he pictured the beast in his mind's eye. "I will do more than talk. I will act. Even now my forces are readying for the final assault." Brady could see the beast clearly in his mind now. His face still shifted from one form to another. The first thing, a human, and then into Jason and Freddy and the alien, a predator, Medusa and Scylla, from all the hated faces he had ever seen, and Brady wondered if the monster could see him. "I can see you as you really are, and I know that you're more afraid of me than I could ever be of you. We've survived. We're smart. We're strong. We'll fight you." "Renamer, you will fail. You are doomed to fail. You think you know me? You have no idea. All you see is the outward manifestation of your own subconscious fears. I am all things to all people, what they hide from, worry about, panic over. These are my masks. Beneath them, I have a face even you would not have suspected, and because I am more than you could ever know, you cannot win. Our destinies are linked." "Ah," said Brady, "I know. Beneath it all, you're a person. Dr. Grindel's in there. Somewhere deep below, there's a human in you, and as long as you're partly human, a human will walk the earth. So as long as you live, humanity lives. You can't win." A scream filled the airwaves, and a bolt of energy moved from the side of anger up Brady's arm to his head, throwing him away from the radio unit through the air, mid against the wall. Brady fell limp against the wall as all the power from the generator failed. End of chapter.